When law enforcement arrived at a rural outbuilding north of Marion, Iowa, on the morning of the 5th of June 2024, the scene before them was so violent that it defied immediate understanding. Inside the structure, 4 people lay dead. Their injuries were catastrophic, so severe that first responders initially struggled to piece together what had occurred. Sitting outside on the sidewalk was a 5-year-old man named Luke Trussell. He appeared detached, glassy-eyed, and eerily calm. Within moments, he would make statements that would shift the investigation instantly. By the end of that day, Iowa would be confronting one of the most disturbing crimes in its modern history. To neighbors and co-workers, Luke Trussell was unremarkable. He lived a quiet life in Marion, worked as a yard laborer for a roofing company, and had only minor prior encounters with the law, an old criminal mischief charge and a misdemeanor assault years earlier. Nothing about him suggested the capacity for mass violence. But beneath that surface, something was unraveling. In the days leading up to the murders, Trussell had been awake for nearly 48 hours, continuously using methamphetamine. Sleep deprivation and heavy drug use pushed his mind into a dangerous spiral. Reality blurred, replaced by paranoid delusions. By the morning of June 5th, he had convinced himself that 4 people staying at a nearby property were part of a human trafficking conspiracy. The property belonged to Lon Brown, whose son Brent Brown and his girlfriend, Kiana Ryan, were staying there temporarily. Also present were Amanda Parker and her boyfriend, Romandis Cooper. None of them had any connection to criminal activity. They were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. That morning, Luke accompanied his father, Larry Trussell, to the property on Otter Road. They were supposed to work on a boat. It should have been an ordinary day. Instead, it became a nightmare. Security cameras mounted on the property later captured crucial moments. Footage showed Luke entering the outbuilding where Cooper and Ryan were staying. Minutes passed. Then Brent Brown and Amanda Parker entered the same building, likely responding to sounds of distress. What happened inside was swift and merciless. Using a 42-inch metal pipe, Luke Trussell attacked each victim with overwhelming force. Prosecutors would later describe the injuries as comparable to those sustained in high-speed vehicle crashes. Skulls fractured, bones shattered. The damage left no possibility of survival. When emergency responders arrived, they initially suspected carbon monoxide poisoning. That theory vanished the moment they stepped inside and saw the blood, the destruction, and the unmistakable signs of brutal violence. Trussell never fled. He remained on scene, wandering in a dazed state. His father could be seen on surveillance footage yelling desperately, demanding someone call for help, trying to comprehend what his son had done. Police initially treated Luke as a potential witness. But before he was read his Miranda rights, he made statements that changed everything. He admitted he had struck the victims. He directed officers to the weapon. The metal pipe was recovered, coated in blood. Paint fragments from the pipe were embedded in the victims' skulls. Trussell's DNA was found on the handle. Blood spatter stained his clothes and shoes. The evidence was overwhelming. During later interviews, Trussell described his delusional belief that the victims were traffickers. He claimed he was acting as a vigilante. He also expressed remorse, worrying that his children would hate him for what he had done. Then came one of the most disturbing details of all. When asked why he committed the murders, Trussell stated that the honest truth was that he wanted to make a movie. Authorities found no evidence that he had recorded the attacks. The statement was later suppressed from trial, but it offered a chilling glimpse into a mind completely untethered from reality. At trial, the defense attempted to deflect blame. They suggested that Luke's father might have been responsible, arguing that surveillance footage did not conclusively show which man entered the outbuilding. They accused investigators of tunnel vision and claimed that Luke's confession was unreliable due to drug intoxication. The prosecution dismantled those arguments methodically. DNA evidence, blood analysis, surveillance footage, and Luke's own admissions formed an unbreakable chain. After a 6-day trial in November 2024 and more than 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Luke Trussell was found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Brent Brown, Amanda Parker, and Kiana Ryan. For the death of Romandis Cooper, he was convicted of second-degree murder, with jurors believing Cooper may have been the first victim, killed before the others entered the building. On the 18th of November 2024, family members of the victims wept quietly in the courtroom. Some whispered, "Thank you," as the verdict was read. Trussell was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison, with formal sentencing scheduled for the 27th of February 2025. Justice was delivered, but nothing could undo the devastation left behind. 4 lives were erased in a matter of minutes, not because of who they were, but because of the delusions of a man who had lost his grip on reality. Iowa was left to grapple with the terrifying truth that extreme violence does not always come from monsters hiding in the shadows. Sometimes, it comes from someone who seemed ordinary until the moment everything shattered. 39 years is a lifetime to wait for justice. Long enough for memories to fade, evidence to gather dust, and for parents to die without ever knowing who took their child from them. For nearly 4 decades, the name Michelle Martino haunted Cedar Rapids, Iowa, a symbol of one of the state's most painful unsolved murders. Until science finally caught up with the truth. Michelle Marie Martino was 18 years old in December 1979. She was a high-achieving senior at Kennedy High School, bright, artistic, and full of promise. She twirled batons, sang in choir, performed in school theater productions, and worked part-time at Westdale Mall. Her future was already taking shape. She planned to attend Iowa State University and study interior design. Friends described Michelle as kind and gentle. She had no known enemies, no dangerous relationships, no reason to believe she was in danger. On the evening of the 19th of December 1979, Michelle attended a holiday banquet with her school choir. She wore a black jersey dress and a white rabbit fur jacket. After the event, she drove her family's 1,972 Buick Electra to Westdale Mall to pick up a winter coat her mother had placed on layaway. It was a simple errand, one she should have completed in less than an hour. Michelle was seen inside the mall around 7 p.m. That was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. At approximately 4 a.m., on December 20, mall security made a horrifying discovery. Michelle's body was found slumped in the driver's seat of her car, still parked near J.C. Penney. She had been stabbed 29 times, her face, neck, and chest bearing the brunt of the attack. Her lungs and aorta were punctured. The fatal wound pierced her heart, causing her to bleed to death inside her own vehicle. There were no signs of robbery. Her purse was intact, but there were clear indications of a violent struggle. And crucially, investigators found blood at the scene that did not belong to Michelle. The blood appeared on her dress and on the car's gear shift, evidence that her attacker had been injured during the assault. But in 1979, DNA technology did not yet exist. That blood would remain a silent witness for decades. Police launched an intensive investigation. They interviewed friends, classmates, former boyfriends, mall employees, anyone who might have crossed paths with Michelle that night. Leads dried up quickly. With no suspects and no way to identify the unknown blood, the case went cold. Michelle's parents, Albert and Janet Martino, waited for answers that never came. They both died in the 1,990 seconds, never knowing who killed their daughter. Then, in 2006, something changed. While reviewing old evidence, Detective Doug Larison noticed that blood samples from Michelle's car had been tested years earlier, but no follow-up had ever been conducted. He pushed for renewed testing. Advances in forensic science had transformed what was once impossible into routine procedure. The Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation developed a full male DNA profile from the decades-old blood. It was a genetic fingerprint preserved by careful evidence handling. The profile was uploaded into CODIS, the National DNA Database. No matches. Years passed. Then, in 2017, investigators partnered with Parabon Nanolabs, a company specializing in DNA phenotyping. Using genetic markers alone, Parabon generated composite images predicting what the unknown suspect might look like. The images renewed public interest, but still produced no solid leads. That's when investigators took a revolutionary step. Parabon suggested using investigative genetic genealogy, the same technique that would later identify the Golden State Killer. In 2018, the suspect's DNA profile was uploaded to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database where users voluntarily share genetic data to find relatives. This time, the DNA spoke. The database returned a partial match, a distant relative, later determined to be a second cousin once removed. From there, genealogists painstakingly built family trees, tracing bloodlines across generations. Branch by branch, investigators eliminated individuals based on age, location, and opportunity. Eventually, the tree narrowed to three brothers who had grown up in Manchester, Iowa: Kenneth Burns, Donald Burns, Jerry Lynn Burns. Investigators placed all three under discreet surveillance. They waited. On the 29th of October 2018, they got their opportunity. 64-year-old Jerry Lynn Burns stopped at a Pizza Ranch restaurant. He drank several sodas using a plastic straw. When he left, officers retrieved the discarded straw from the trash and sent it for testing. The result was unequivocal. Jerry Burns' DNA matched the blood found on Michelle Martino's clothing, with odds of more than 1 in 100 billion against a random match. On the 19th of December 2018, exactly 39 years to the day after Michelle's murder, detectives arrived at Burns' powder coating business in Manchester. During questioning, Burns appeared cold and emotionless. When shown the computer-generated images derived from his own DNA, he remarked that they looked nothing like him. Investigators informed him that they had obtained his DNA from an item he discarded in public. Burns denied any involvement. He claimed he did not know Michelle and had never met her. When pressed, he repeatedly stated only one thing: test the DNA. They already had. Jerry Lynn Burns was arrested that day. In 1979, Burns had been 25 years old, married with 2 young children. He worked selling farm equipment and later held positions with John Deere. Over the years, he co-owned a truck stop and lived a seemingly ordinary life. His name had never appeared in the original investigation. He had remained invisible for nearly 4 decades. Burns hired high-profile attorneys, including Kathleen Zellner, known for representing Stephen Avery. His defense challenged the legality of genetic genealogy, arguing that collecting DNA from a discarded straw violated constitutional rights. Judges disagreed. The court ruled that Burns had no reasonable expectation of privacy in an item he had thrown away in a public restaurant. The trial began in February 2020. Prosecutors presented DNA evidence so strong it left little room for doubt. Experts explained the astronomical odds of coincidence. A jailhouse informant testified that Burns had made disturbing remarks referencing the mall where Michelle died. Burns never took the stand. After just 3 hours of deliberation on the 24th of February 2020, the jury returned its verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Michelle's sister, Janelle, and her brother-in-law wept as the verdict was read, relief mixed with grief that their parents had not lived to see this day. On the 7th of August 2020, Jerry Lynn Burns was sentenced to life in prison without parole. His appeals were later denied unanimously by the Iowa Supreme Court. Today, Michelle Martino would be in her early 60s. Instead, her case stands as a landmark in forensic history, a testament to patience, preserved evidence, and the quiet power of science. A killer who believed time had erased his crime learned the truth far too late. Time does not forget. For more than 3 years, Dave Krupa lived in a constant state of fear. His phone buzzed day and night with text messages. Emails flooded his inbox. The messages were threatening, obsessive, and deeply personal. They claimed to know where he was, what he was wearing, and what he was thinking. "I'm watching you. I have a key to your apartment. You'll never get away from me." The messages appeared to come from a woman named Kari Farver. The problem was, Kari Farver had been dead the entire time. In 2012, Dave Krupa was an auto mechanic in Omaha, Nebraska, trying to rebuild his life after a divorce. He joined an online dating site and met a woman who called herself Liz. Her real name was Shanna Liz Golyar. She was a single mother, intelligent, confident, and emotionally intense. Dave made it clear from the start that he wasn't looking for anything serious. Liz said she understood. A few months later, a woman named Kari Farver walked into Dave's auto shop to have her Ford Explorer serviced. The connection was immediate. Kari was vibrant and charismatic, a single mother from Macedonia, Iowa, who worked in information technology. When Dave asked her out, she was equally clear she didn't want a serious relationship either. For a brief moment, everything seemed simple. That illusion shattered in November 2012. One evening, as Kari was leaving Dave's apartment, she crossed paths with Liz in the hallway. The two women locked eyes for just a few seconds. It was brief, silent, but it would become the hinge on which everything turned. On the 13th of November 2012, Kari spent the night at Dave's apartment. The next morning, he kissed her goodbye as she left for work. She was never seen alive again. Within hours, Dave began receiving strange text messages from Carrie's phone. She asked about moving in together. When Dave declined, the tone shifted abruptly. Anger, hatred, obsession. The messages escalated rapidly. Carrie claimed she was watching him constantly, that she still had a spare key, that she was letting herself into his apartment when he wasn't home. Soon, the harassment spread beyond Dave. Carrie's mother, Nancy, received texts claiming her daughter had moved to Kansas for a new job, abandoning her teenage son. Carrie missed her son's birthday. She missed Thanksgiving. She missed her father's funeral. None of it made sense. Nancy reported her daughter missing, but authorities initially believed Carrie had left voluntarily. Meanwhile, the digital torment intensified. Over the next 3 years, more than 50,000 text messages and 15,000 emails were sent, many appearing to come from Carrie. Some messages arrived while Dave was sitting next to Liz, watching her hands, knowing she wasn't typing. Yet the messages kept coming. In 2013, Liz claimed her house had been set on fire. Her pets died in the blaze. Almost immediately, messages arrived from Carrie's accounts, taking credit for the fire. "I set that nasty house on fire." The shared trauma bonded Dave and Liz even closer. They believed they were victims of the same stalker. Liz played the role perfectly, terrified, supportive, and sympathetic. But investigators were beginning to see cracks. In 2015, Detective Ryan Avis and investigator Jim Doty reopened the case. They approached it from 2 angles, one treating Carrie as alive, the other assuming she was deceased. A cyber investigator named Tony Cava began analyzing thousands of digital communications. What he uncovered was staggering. The messages allegedly sent by Carrie were traced back to IP addresses and devices connected to Liz Golyar. Investigators discovered Liz had created numerous fake online personas, sending emails posing as friends, enemies, and even Dave's ex-partner, some of whom confessed to killing Carrie. One piece of physical evidence sealed it. Carrie's abandoned Ford Explorer had been found years earlier. Inside, investigators located a mint container bearing Liz Golyar's fingerprint. Then, while examining an old cell phone microchip belonging to Liz, they found something horrifying. A photograph. It showed a human foot in an advanced state of decomposition. Investigators believed it belonged to Carrie Farver. The picture wasn't sent to anyone. It wasn't stored for any practical purpose. It appeared to be a private trophy, a reminder of what Liz had done. Further investigation revealed Liz had gone to extraordinary lengths to maintain the illusion. She sent threatening messages to herself. She shot herself in the leg and blamed Carrie. She set her own house on fire. Every act was designed to keep the lie alive. In December 2016, more than 4 years after Carrie vanished, Shanna Golyar was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and second-degree arson. The case against her was unlike most homicide prosecutions. There was no body, no murder weapon, no eyewitnesses. What the state had instead was an overwhelming mountain of digital evidence, thousands upon thousands of messages documenting obsession, control, and manipulation. At trial in 2017, prosecutors laid out the narrative clearly. Liz could not accept rejection. When she realized Dave preferred Carrie, she eliminated her and then used Carrie's identity as a weapon, tormenting everyone connected to her. Judge Timothy Burns delivered the verdict on the 24th of May 2017. Guilty. He stated that the circumstantial evidence was so overwhelming that the absence of a body did not create reasonable doubt. Carrie Farver did not voluntarily disappear, he said. She was murdered. On the 15th of August 2017, Shanna Golyar was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus additional time for arson. Carrie's body has never been recovered. In 2024, the case gained renewed attention after the release of the Netflix documentary, Lover, Stalker, Killer. It shocked a new generation of viewers with a chilling truth. In the digital age, obsession can wear the mask of love, and technology can be both the weapon and the witness. For Carrie Farver's family, justice came without closure, no grave to visit, no remains to bury. Only the certainty that her voice, used so cruelly against those she loved, was never truly hers at all. Brooklyn, Iowa, is the kind of town where people leave their doors unlocked. A farming community of fewer than 2,000 residents, it prides itself on safety, familiarity, and trust. On the evening of the 18th of July 2018, That sense of security was shattered in a way the town would never fully recover from. 20-year-old Molly Cecilia Tibbetts went out for an evening jog and never came home. Molly was a psychology major at the University of Iowa, preparing for her sophomore year. She dreamed of earning a doctorate, writing books, and helping others understand the human mind. Friends described her as kind, energetic, and deeply connected to her family. She worked at a children's day camp and maintained close friendships, including a daily Snapchat streak with her cousin that had lasted more than 600 consecutive days. That summer, Molly was staying at her boyfriend Dalton Jack's home in Brooklyn while he worked long hours on a construction project. On July 18th, Dalton left for work early. Molly spent the day caring for his dogs, then decided to go for her usual run that evening. At approximately 7:30 p.m., Molly put on her running clothes, black shorts, a sports bra, running shoes, and stepped outside. Surveillance footage later captured her jogging past a nearby camera at 7:48 p.m. She appeared relaxed, focused, and completely unaware of the danger closing in around her. When Molly failed to show up for work the next morning, alarm bells rang immediately. Her phone was dead. Her Fitbit showed no activity. By that evening, her family reported her missing. The response was massive. Within days, federal agents flooded into Brooklyn. The FBI joined local and state authorities. Volunteers searched fields, ponds, and wooded areas. Helicopters scanned the landscape from above. Yard signs bearing Molly's face appeared across the state. The reward for information climbed past $400,000. Molly's mother, Laura Calderwood, pleaded publicly for her daughter's safe return. She insisted Molly would never disappear voluntarily. Her voice trembled, but her resolve never wavered. As days turned into weeks, hope began to fade. Investigators combed through Molly's digital footprint. They obtained data from her Fitbit and phone records. Surveillance footage revealed something unsettling. A black Chevrolet Malibu repeatedly driving past the area where Molly had been jogging. Over a span of 20 minutes, the vehicle circled the same route multiple times. This was no coincidence. On August 16, nearly a month after Molly vanished, Deputy Sheriff Steve Kivey spotted a black Malibu with distinctive aftermarket features. The car stood out. Investigators had been searching for hundreds of similar vehicles, but this one matched the footage exactly. The driver was 4-year-old Christian Bahena Rivera. Rivera was an undocumented immigrant from Mexico who had been working at a local dairy farm under a false identity since 2014. Co-workers described him as quiet and hard-working. Nothing about him had raised immediate suspicion until now. Rivera was brought in for questioning. At first, he denied any involvement, but as investigators pressed him, his story began to unravel. Eventually, Rivera admitted that he had seen Molly running and found her attractive. He followed her in his car. He then parked and began running alongside her. According to Rivera, Molly threatened to call the police and demanded that he leave her alone. He claimed he became angry and then blacked out. What he remembered next was chilling. Rivera told investigators that when he regained awareness, Molly was in the trunk of his car. He drove to a remote cornfield, carried her body approximately 20 meters into the rows, and concealed her beneath corn leaves. On August 21, Rivera led investigators directly to Molly's remains. An autopsy revealed she had been stabbed between 7 and 12 times in the chest, neck, and skull. The wounds were fatal. There was no evidence she survived long after the attack. Rivera's arrest ignited immediate national controversy. Then President Donald Trump referenced Molly's death at a political rally, using the case to argue for stricter immigration policies. Molly's family responded forcefully, asking that her death not be used to promote hatred or political agendas. Her father wrote publicly that Molly would have rejected racism and division. The trial began in May 2021. Prosecutors presented surveillance footage showing Rivera's Malibu circling Molly's jogging route. DNA evidence placed Molly's blood in Rivera's trunk. His own statements led investigators to her body. The case against him was strong. Then Rivera took the stand. He told a completely different story. Rivera claimed that 2 masked men had broken into his trailer, held him at gunpoint, and forced him to drive them around. He said these men were responsible for Molly's death and that he was merely a terrified participant. Prosecutors dismantled the story piece by piece. There was no evidence of masked men, no evidence of coercion, no explanation for why Rivera's car, his DNA, and his actions aligned perfectly with the crime. Assistant Attorney General Scott Brown told jurors that Rivera had not blacked out, he had simply refused to accept responsibility. After 2 days of deliberation, totaling 7 hours, the jury returned its verdict on the 28th of May, 2021. Guilty of first-degree murder. On the 30th of August 2021, Rivera was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the mandatory sentence under Iowa law. As the verdict was read through an interpreter, Rivera showed little emotion. Molly Tibbetts' life ended on an ordinary summer evening. A routine jog became a national tragedy. For her family, no sentence could ever restore what was taken, the future she dreamed of, the books she would never write, the life she never had the chance to live. Her case remains a stark reminder that violence can erupt without warning, even in places that feel safe. And for Brooklyn, Iowa, the illusion of innocence was lost forever. Some killers silence witnesses to avoid prison. Dustin Honkin erased entire families. On a scorching July day in 1993, 2 little girls, 10-year-old Candy Duncan and her 6-year-old sister Amber, were playing in their swimsuits when a knock came at the door. Within hours, they would be kneeling in a remote wooded area outside Mason City, Iowa, executed with single shots to the back of their heads. Their crime was being home when a drug trafficker came hunting for an informant. Dustin Lee Honkin grew up in Britt, Iowa, the son of an alcoholic father with a history of bank robberies. Despite the chaos at home, Honkin was intelligent, particularly gifted in mathematics and science. He enrolled in community college chemistry courses and earned high grades. But instead of pursuing a legitimate career, he became fascinated by methamphetamine. Honkin didn't just want to cook drugs, he wanted to master them. He studied chemistry textbooks, scientific journals, and production techniques obsessively. His notes were meticulous. His goal was scale pure product, mass distribution, and profit. By the early 1992s, he had built a significant meth operation, supplying dealers in Mason City and generating hundreds of thousands of dollars. One of those dealers was Greg Nicholson. In March 1993, Honkin and his associate Tim Cutcomp were arrested on federal drug charges. Facing serious prison time, Nicholson made a choice that sealed his fate. He became an informant. He wore a wire and recorded Honkin arranging drug deals. Authorities found nearly 150 grams of pure meth in Nicholson's possession. When Honkin learned Nicholson had turned, paranoia consumed him. Rather than flee, Honkin decided to eliminate the problem permanently. On the 26th of July 1993, Honkin and his girlfriend, Angela Johnson, tracked Nicholson to a home where he had moved in with his girlfriend, Lori Duncan, and her 2 daughters, Candy and Amber. Lori had no involvement in drugs. She didn't know Nicholson was an informant. She was simply a single mother trying to survive. Honkin and Johnson kidnapped all 4. They transported them to a secluded wooded area outside Mason City. There, Honkin carried out one of the most cold-blooded crimes in Iowa history. Nicholson and Lori Duncan were bound, gagged, and shot multiple times. Candy and Amber were forced to kneel and were each shot once in the back of the head, execution style. Their bodies were buried in shallow graves. With his primary witness gone, Honkin withdrew his guilty plea on the drug charges. Then, another problem emerged. Terry DeGius, another dealer connected to Honkin, also knew too much. He disappeared next. DeGius was lured to a property where Honkin beat him with a baseball bat and shot him. His body was buried separately. By 1995, every key witness against Honkin was dead. Federal charges collapsed due to lack of witnesses. For a time, it appeared Honkin had gotten away with murder. But law enforcement never stopped watching. In 1996, authorities searched Honkin's Mason City home and discovered a fully operational meth lab. Even more disturbing were notebooks detailing not just drug manufacturing, but methods for restraining and silencing people. Honkin was arrested again. This time, his former associate Tim Cutcomp cooperated, wearing a wire. But the real breakthrough came years later. In 2000, investigators planted a jailhouse informant who befriended Angela Johnson. Over time, she began talking. Eventually, she drew a hand-drawn map marking burial locations. When authorities followed the map, they found the remains of all 5 victims exactly where Johnson said they would be. Honkin was charged with 5 counts of murder in furtherance of a continuing criminal enterprise. Although Iowa had abolished the death penalty decades earlier, This was a federal case making Honken eligible for execution. The trial in 2004 was unlike any Iowa had seen. Security was extreme. Jurors were anonymous. Honken wore a concealed stun belt in court. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, informant testimony, forensic findings, Johnson's map, and years of investigative work. The defense portrayed Honken as a misguided intellectual, someone fascinated by chemistry who went too far. Prosecutors responded with the undeniable truth. Honken had murdered 2 children to protect his drug empire. In October 2005, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts. Dustin Honken was sentenced to death. Angela Johnson was also sentenced to death, though her sentence was later reduced to life in prison. Honken spent years on federal death row in Terre Haute, Indiana. During that time, he reportedly found religion and worked with a Catholic nun as a spiritual advisor. But remorse never erased what he had done. On the 17th of July 2020, at 4:36 p.m., Dustin Honken was executed by lethal injection. He was 52 years old. He kept his eyes fixed on the ceiling and did not address the families of his victims. He became the first person executed for an Iowa-related case since 1963. For the families of Candy, Amber, Lori, Greg, and Terry, the execution brought a measure of justice, but no closure. Nothing could undo the horror inflicted on 2 children whose lives ended before they had even begun. Honken's case stands as one of the darkest chapters in Iowa's criminal history. A man who valued drugs and control over human life. A killer who believed fear would protect him. He was wrong. The 911 call came in at 5:23 a.m. on the 26th of May 2012, shattering the stillness of a rural Iowa morning. "My wife's been shot," the caller cried, his voice breaking between sobs. "She's pregnant." The caller was 23-year-old Seth Tekel. The victim was his wife, Lisa Tekel, 17 weeks pregnant with their first child, a daughter they had already named Zoe Marie. When first responders arrived at the couple's trailer near Agency, Iowa, they found Lisa lying in bed with a gunshot wound. She was already gone. So was the unborn child she carried. From the very beginning, Seth insisted it was a home invasion. According to his story, he had been in the shower when an unknown intruder broke in, shot Lisa, and fled. Seth claimed he heard a loud bang, rushed out, saw the door open, and found his wife unresponsive. There were no signs of forced entry. No clear struggle, no footprints, no witnesses. But what followed would become one of the most complex and emotionally draining murder cases in Iowa history, one that required 3 separate trials before the truth finally prevailed. Lisa Caldwell had met Seth years earlier while working at a bowling alley. She was athletic, competitive, and deeply committed to public service. Lisa worked as a jailer and served as a reserve deputy, following in the footsteps of her father, Todd Caldwell, a respected law enforcement officer. Seth also aspired to a law enforcement career. From the outside, they appeared to be a young couple with shared goals and a promising future. But investigators soon discovered cracks beneath that image. As agents from the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation began interviewing Seth, inconsistencies surfaced almost immediately. His timeline shifted. Details changed. Certain facts didn't align with physical evidence at the scene. Then came the phone. When investigators examined Seth's cell phone records, they uncovered months of explicit text messages between Seth and a coworker named Rachel McFarland. The messages weren't casual. They were intimate, emotional, obsessive. Seth had repeatedly promised Rachel he would leave Lisa. Rachel testified that Seth had become increasingly desperate in the days leading up to Lisa's death. He begged her to give him 2 weeks. When asked what he meant, Seth refused to explain. Those messages would later be described by prosecutors as reading like a countdown. Investigators also learned that the weapon used to kill Lisa was a shotgun from inside the home one Seth had failed to mention during his initial statements. That omission raised serious suspicion. Still, there was no direct evidence, no eyewitness, no confession. The case would hinge entirely on circumstantial evidence. Seth's first trial began in February 2013. The defense argued aggressively that a neighbor, Brian Tate, a mentally ill veteran who had feuded with the couple, was the real killer. The prosecution presented evidence of the affair, the weapon, and Seth's inconsistent statements. After days of deliberation, the jury deadlocked. 11 jurors voted to convict. 1 voted to acquit. A mistrial was declared. The second trial took place later that year in a different county due to pretrial publicity. Once again, the defense blamed Brian Tate, but tragedy struck before the trial concluded. Tate died of natural causes. His family believed the stress of being publicly accused had contributed to his death. The second jury also deadlocked. This time, the vote was 9-3 in favor of conviction. Another mistrial. Many wondered whether the case would ever reach a conclusion. Prosecutors refused to give up. The third trial began in July 2014. This time, both sides changed strategy. The defense revealed that Lisa herself had been involved in an affair, attempting to portray the marriage as troubled on both sides. Prosecutors countered that none of it explained the physical evidence or Seth's actions. Rachel McFarland testified once again. The jury saw every message, every photo, every promise Seth had made. The timeline was laid bare. On the 27th of July 2014, after just 4 hours of deliberation spread across 2 days, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty. Seth Tekel was convicted of first-degree murder and non-consensual termination of a human pregnancy. In the courtroom, Lisa's family finally broke down. Her father wiped away tears. Her mother delivered a devastating victim impact statement. "You made sure Lisa could not resist," she said. "You took her life and our granddaughter's future." When the judge asked Seth if he had anything to say, he replied coldly, "Not at this time." He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 25 years. The case had taken more than 2 years, 3 trials, an immeasurable emotional toll, but justice had finally been delivered. Lisa Tekel's death was not the result of a stranger breaking in during the night. It was the result of deception, betrayal, and a man willing to destroy everything to avoid consequences. 3 trials were required to uncover the truth. But in the end, the truth did not change. On the morning of the 3rd of November 2021, a missing person report was filed in Fairfield, Iowa, a quiet town of just under 9,000 residents. 66-year-old Spanish teacher Nohema Graber had not returned home from her usual afternoon walk. Within hours, Fairfield would be forced to confront a truth so disturbing that it would ripple across the nation. Nohema Graber was a beloved educator. Originally from Mexico, she had dedicated decades of her life to teaching Spanish, first in Ottumwa and later at Fairfield High School. Former students described her as passionate, patient, and deeply committed to her role not just as a teacher, but as a mentor. Every afternoon after school, Graber followed the same routine. She drove to Chautauqua Park, parked her van, and walked the trails to decompress after long days in the classroom. On the 2nd of November 2021, she did exactly that. She never came back. Search efforts began quickly. Teachers, students, volunteers, and law enforcement combed the park. Before long, they found Graber's van, abandoned on a nearby rural road. Not far from it, hidden beneath a tarp, railroad ties, and a wheelbarrow, they discovered her body. She had been beaten to death with a baseball bat. The brutality of the crime shocked even seasoned investigators. But the most disturbing revelation had yet to come. The killers were not strangers. They were her students. Willard Miller and Jeremy Goodale were both 16-year-old juniors at Fairfield High School. According to investigators, the murder was not spontaneous. It had been planned for at least 2 weeks. The motive was chilling in its simplicity: a bad grade. Miller had been struggling in Spanish class. For a student focused on academic achievement, the failing grade felt catastrophic. Instead of seeking help or accepting responsibility, Miller chose violence. He recruited Goodale, a friend and classmate, to help carry out the plan. They selected Chautauqua Park because they knew Graber walked there daily. They planned the timing, the weapon, and even how to conceal her body. On the afternoon of November 2nd, Miller met with Graber at school to discuss his grade. Shortly afterward, Graber drove to the park for her walk. Witnesses later reported seeing her van leave the park, with 2 young males inside. According to court testimony, the teens ambushed Graber on the trail. Miller struck first with the baseball bat. After she fell, Goodale also struck her. The attack left her with no chance of survival. They dragged her body deeper into the woods and covered it, attempting to hide their crime. Then they walked away, as if nothing had happened. The investigation moved quickly. Students began coming forward with critical information. Snapchat messages surfaced, messages in which Goodale had made admissions about his involvement in Graber's death. Some messages explicitly named Miller as the instigator. Police brought both teens in for questioning. Miller initially denied everything. Then he claimed he knew about the murder but hadn't participated. Finally, he spun an elaborate story involving masked individuals who supposedly forced him to help dispose of the body. Investigators saw through it immediately. The baseball bat belonged to Miller. Surveillance placed both teens at key locations. Witnesses had picked them up walking along the same rural road where Graber's van was later found. The digital evidence was overwhelming. On the 12th of November 2021, just 9 days after Graber's body was discovered, both Willard Miller and Jeremy Goodale were arrested and charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Despite their age, prosecutors charged them as adults. The legal process stretched on for more than a year. Defense attorneys filed motions challenging evidence. Strategies shifted as Goodale became a potential witness against Miller. Then, in April 2023, just days before trial was set to begin, both teens changed their pleas. They pleaded guilty. In court, Goodale delivered chilling testimony. He stated plainly that he understood Miller intended to kill Mrs. Graber and that Miller had brought the bat and other supplies to carry out the murder. Miller admitted planning the crime but attempted to minimize his role, claiming he did not strike Graber, a claim contradicted by evidence and testimony. Sentencing hearings were held separately. In July 2023, Miller was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 35 years. The judge cited the calculated nature of the crime and the fact that it was planned weeks in advance. Goodale was sentenced later that year to life with the possibility of parole after 25 years, reflecting the court's determination that Miller was the primary instigator. Graber's family delivered emotional victim impact statements. Her son spoke of the void left behind. Her husband, Paul, passed away before seeing full resolution of the case. A teacher who dedicated her life to guiding young people had been murdered by the very students she tried to help. The Fairfield community was left reeling. Parents questioned how something so horrific could happen over something as trivial as a grade. Educators across the country mourned a colleague lost to senseless violence. Nohema Graber's murder stands as one of the most tragic examples of misplaced rage and entitlement, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous threats are not strangers lurking in the dark, but those sitting quietly in the classroom. The 911 call came from a quiet cul-de-sac in northeast Cedar Rapids, Iowa, on the morning of the 15th of June 2021. "There's been a shooting," a young man said, his voice trembling. "A man broke in and shot me and my dad." When officers arrived at the upscale home on Oakleaf Court, they expected to find a violent home invasion. What they discovered instead was something far more horrifying. Inside the house were 3 bodies: 61-year-old Jan Jackson, 68-year-old Melissa Jackson, and their 19-year-old daughter, Sabrina Jackson. All 3 had been shot to death in separate rooms. The only survivor was 20-year-old Alexander Jackson, the son who had made the frantic call, sitting on the front steps with a gunshot wound to his foot. He told officers that a masked intruder had entered the home and opened fire before fleeing out the back door. At first glance, Alexander seemed like the perfect victim. He had no criminal record. He was an Eagle Scout. He played the flute in his high school band. Neighbors described him as polite, quiet, and responsible, the kind of young man who mowed lawns for elderly neighbors and kept to himself. But investigators quickly realized something wasn't right. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere in the home. Doors and windows were intact. Furniture hadn't been disturbed. Nothing appeared stolen. Even more troubling, Ring doorbell cameras from neighboring homes showed no one entering or leaving the Jackson residence that morning before police arrived. The intruder Alexander described seemed to exist only in his imagination. The crime scene itself raised further red flags. Jan Jackson had been shot 5 times, once in the chest, once in the neck, and 3 times in the back of the head. Each wound was independently fatal. Sabrina was found shot in her bed, killed as she slept. Melissa was discovered in the master bedroom, shot multiple times at close range. 1 bullet entered her left eye, leaving visible gunpowder residue on her skin. This was not a panicked burglary. It was execution-style violence. The murder weapon was soon identified as a .22 caliber Browning rifle belonging to the Jackson family. Investigators found the rifle box hidden under Alexander's bed. 2 clear palm prints were lifted from the weapon, both belonging to Alexander. The rifle itself was unusual. It had a non-standard loading mechanism so uncommon that a crime scene investigator with extensive firearms experience had to look up an instructional video to learn how to operate it. Prosecutors later argued that a random intruder would not know how to use such a weapon, but a family member would. Blood stain analysis told another critical story. Investigators found blood near Alexander's bed, suggesting he had shot himself in the foot there, not downstairs, during a struggle, as he claimed. The injury appeared staged. When questioned by detectives, Alexander stuck rigidly to his story. He described a black man wearing dark clothing and green shoes. His description was vague, generic, almost rehearsed. As the interrogation continued, detectives shifted focus to Alexander's personal life. Behind the image of a well-adjusted college student, they found a young man under intense pressure. His grades at the University of Iowa had collapsed. His GPA was in free fall. His bank account held barely $30. And his father, Jan, had recently delivered an ultimatum: get a job or move out. For a young man raised with high expectations and a history of success, the prospect of failure may have felt unbearable. Prosecutors would later argue that Alexander saw no way out. The trial began in January 2023. The state presented a methodical case built entirely on evidence. No forced entry, surveillance footage, palm prints on the rifle, blood-stain patterns, the staged gunshot wound, and motive: academic failure, financial stress, and fear of disappointing his family. Assistant County Attorney Monica Slaughter laid out the sequence clearly. Alexander shot his father as he came down the stairs. He then stood over him and fired additional shots. He killed his sister while she slept. He executed his mother at close range. Finally, he shot himself in the foot to support the intruder narrative. One detail from the 911 call stood out. Alexander never once asked about his mother or sister. He never called out for them. He already knew they were dead. The defense argued investigators had rushed to judgment. They portrayed the Jackson family as loving and harmonious. They insisted Alexander had no reason to commit such an act. The jury disagreed. After 6 hours of deliberation, on the 25th of January 2023, the verdict was read: guilty on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. Alexander showed little reaction as deputies placed him in handcuffs. At sentencing, family members spoke through tears. Jan's sister addressed the court, stating that Alexander had tried to present himself as a victim, but the truth was now undeniable. On the 3rd of March 2023, the judge sentenced Alexander Jackson to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. In January 2025, the Iowa Court of Appeals upheld the convictions, citing overwhelming evidence of guilt. An entire family had been erased in a single morning, not by an intruder, but by the person they trusted most. The Jackson case remains one of Iowa's most disturbing crimes. A reminder that desperation, shame, and fear can drive unimaginable violence, and that sometimes the greatest threat comes from inside the home. Some murder cases are solved through DNA, fingerprints, or surveillance footage. Others hinge on something far more fragile and controversial: memory. On the 13th of October 1992, 22-year-old Corey Wacha was found brutally beaten to death in his rural West Liberty, Iowa home. He had been struck 13 times with an aluminum baseball bat. Blood spattered the bedroom. The attack was violent, personal, and rage-filled. Yet despite the brutality, investigators had almost nothing to work with. Corey was a former high school football star, widely liked, engaged to his longtime girlfriend, and helping run his family's bar. But behind the scenes, his life was complicated. He had been involved in a secret, year-long affair with a woman named Annette Hazen. The night before his death, tensions exploded. Annette waited outside the bar after Corey finished work, angry that he left with another woman. They argued. According to later accounts, the confrontation ended with them having sex at Corey's home before Annette left. The next morning, Corey's fiancée went to work as usual. When she returned that evening, the house was wrong. The screen door stood open. Their dog was outside. Corey lay face down on the bedroom floor, beaten beyond recognition. Investigators quickly focused on Annette. She had motive. She had been one of the last people to see Corey alive. But there was no physical evidence linking her to the crime. No fingerprints, no blood, no DNA. Annette cooperated fully with police and even passed a polygraph test. She also had an alibi supported by a relative who said they were working together that morning. With no forensic evidence and no solid witnesses, the case went cold. For the next 25 years, Corey's murder remained unsolved. Annette moved on. She married, had children and grandchildren, and took the last name Cahill. She worked in newspaper production and later for a police training institute. She lived quietly, never charged with another crime. Then, in December 2017, everything changed. An ICU nurse named Jessica Becker approached Iowa investigators with a story she had carried since childhood. In 1992, Becker had been 9 years old and frequently spent the night at Annette's family farmhouse. Not long after Corey's murder, she witnessed something that haunted her for decades. Late one night, Becker and her friends snuck downstairs. What they saw stopped them cold. Annette was lighting black candles in the dining room. She was crying, sobbing, apologizing to someone who wasn't there. "Corey, I never meant to hurt you. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to kill you." Terrified, the girls ran back upstairs. Becker told her mother what she had seen, but the family was afraid to go to police. Annette's family was influential. One relative was a sheriff. The moment passed and then decades followed. Now, as an adult and a military reservist, Becker felt compelled to speak. Investigators reopened the case. They also uncovered additional troubling details. Annette had reportedly mentioned Corey being killed with a baseball bat before that information had ever been released publicly and before the weapon was even found. In May 2018, Annette Cahill was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The case immediately sparked controversy. At trial in 2019, prosecutors relied almost entirely on witness testimony. There was no DNA evidence, no fingerprints, no physical link tying Annette to the crime scene. The defense argued that the case rested on unreliable childhood memory recalled 25 years later. After days of testimony, the jury deliberated. 11 jurors voted to acquit, 1 voted to convict. A mistrial was declared. Prosecutors tried again. At the second trial, a new witness testified, a man who claimed Annette had burned blood-stained clothing shortly after the murder. He admitted he never reported it because he avoided police. The defense attacked his credibility, pointing to his criminal background and delayed disclosure. This time, the jury deadlocked again, but the judge ordered them to continue deliberating. Eventually, in September 2019, the jury returned a verdict, not of first-degree murder, but second-degree murder. Annette Cahill was sentenced to 50 years in prison. She has maintained her innocence ever since. Her appeals argued that the decades-long delay violated her constitutional rights and that the conviction relied on unreliable testimony rather than evidence. The Iowa Supreme Court denied those appeals in 2022. The case remains deeply polarizing. Supporters argue Annette was wrongfully convicted based on a childhood memory and circumstantial testimony. Critics argue the confessions, statements, and behavior form a disturbing pattern too significant to ignore. In recent years, the Drake University Wrongful Convictions Clinic has taken interest in her case. Motions have been filed seeking DNA testing of evidence collected decades ago, including the baseball bat and items found at the scene. Whether those tests will ever provide clarity remains unknown. Annette Cahill's case forces an uncomfortable question. Can justice truly exist without physical evidence? Or does memory, fragile, emotional, and imperfect, sometimes carry enough weight to decide a life? More than 30 years after Corey Watch's death, the truth remains contested, and the line between justice and doubt has never been thinner. On a cold November morning in 2018, a frantic 911 call came from a farm in rural Earlville, Iowa. "My wife fell on a corn rake," the caller said. His voice was urgent, but controlled. He explained that he was already driving her to the hospital. She was bleeding badly. The caller was 42-year-old hog farmer Todd Mullis. The victim was his wife, 39-year-old Amy Mullis. By the time emergency responders reached them, Amy was dead. At first, it sounded like a tragic farming accident, an unfortunate mishap involving a common agricultural tool. But as doctors examined Amy's injuries, something immediately felt wrong. And within days, investigators would uncover one of the most calculated murders in Iowa history. Amy Mullis was a registered nurse. She was known for her warmth, her energy, and her compassion. Friends described her as bubbly and outgoing, someone who could walk into a room and instantly lift the mood. She met Todd Mullis at a county fair in 2003. Todd was a hardworking farmer with a large hog operation and significant land holdings. From the outside, they looked like a perfect rural family. But beneath that image, the The marriage was fractured. Years earlier, Amy had an affair. Todd never truly forgave her. According to friends, he became increasingly controlling, tracking her movements, limiting her friendships, timing her errands. Some described Amy as feeling trapped. One friend later said Amy once told her, "If I'm ever found dead, you'll know Todd did something to me." By 2018, Amy was having another affair, this time with Jerry Burns, a farm employee. She confided to friends that she wanted to leave Todd, but feared his reaction. A divorce would have meant splitting a multi-million-dollar farm operation. On the 10th of November 2018, Amy had recently undergone surgery and was still recovering. That day, she, Todd, and their 13-year-old son, Tristan, were working on the farm. Todd later told investigators that Amy complained of dizziness. He asked her to walk to a nearby shed to retrieve a pet carrier for some kittens. She never returned. Todd sent Tristan to check on her. Moments later, the boy's screams echoed across the property. Amy was found face down inside the shed, with a corn rake embedded in her back. Todd claimed he removed the rake so he could get her into his truck and rushed her toward the hospital. But doctors noticed something chilling. The corn rake had 4 metal tines. Amy had 6 puncture wounds. That alone made a simple fall nearly impossible. The state medical examiner later discovered even more. Some wounds angled upward, others angled downward. Amy had not fallen onto the rake. She had been stabbed multiple times. Her death was ruled a homicide. Investigators began peeling back layers of the Mullis family life. Friends spoke openly about Amy's fear and her desire to leave. Then came the digital evidence. Todd Mullis's iPad search history revealed disturbing queries in the days and months before Amy's death. Killing unfaithful women. What happens to cheaters in history? Organs in the human body. And one phrase that stood out above all others: the thrill of the kill. Todd claimed his wife and children also used the iPad. But he couldn't explain the timing or the content. In February 2019, Todd Mullis was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. At trial, prosecutors laid out a clear theory. Todd discovered the affair. He feared losing his land, his money, and his image. He sent Amy to the shed alone, ambushed her, stabbed her with the corn rake, returned to the barn, and then sent his son to discover her body. The most devastating witness was Tristan. Testifying via closed-circuit television, the teenager admitted that his father had been out of his sight briefly long enough to commit the crime. Jerry Burns testified about his affair with Amy and her fear that Todd might kill her if he found out. Todd took the stand in his own defense. Under cross-examination, he made a fatal admission. Amy's death was not an accident. Someone had stabbed her 2 or 3 times with the rake. He just insisted that person wasn't him. The jury didn't believe it. After 2 days of deliberation, the verdict was read in September 2019. Guilty of first-degree murder, Todd Mullis was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His appeals were denied. He would die behind bars. Amy Mullis's murder shocked rural Iowa. A trusted husband, a family farm, a staged accident involving a common tool, all hiding calculated violence driven by jealousy and control. For their children, the damage was irreversible. A mother lost, a father imprisoned, a childhood forever broken. The corn rake murder became a national symbol of how ordinary settings can conceal extraordinary evil and how lies, no matter how carefully constructed, eventually collapse under the weight of truth. Across Iowa, these crimes unfolded in different towns, different decades, and under vastly different circumstances. Some involved strangers, others destroyed families from within. Some were solved in days. Others waited silently for decades until science, persistence, or a single human voice finally broke the silence. But when you step back and look at all 10 cases together, a disturbing pattern begins to emerge. None of these crimes announced themselves as monsters. Luke Trussell looked like an ordinary laborer. Jerry Lynn Burns lived an unremarkable life for nearly 40 years after murder. Shanna Golyar hid behind text messages and digital identities. Christian Bahena Rivera blended into a farming community. Dustin Honkin masked brutality with intelligence. Seth Tekel presented himself as a grieving husband. Willard Miller and Jeremy Goodale were just students. Alexander Jackson was an Eagle Scout. Annette Cahill became a grandmother. Todd Mullis was a respected farmer. In every case, evil wore the mask of normalcy. These stories remind us that violence doesn't always come with warning signs. It doesn't always come from the shadows. Sometimes it grows quietly, fed by jealousy, obsession, entitlement, fear, or the refusal to face consequences. What ultimately ended each of these stories wasn't luck. It was evidence. DNA preserved for decades. Digital footprints that never truly disappear. Witnesses who finally found the courage to speak. Investigators who refused to let time erase the truth. Families who waited sometimes their entire lives for answers. Justice, when it came, did not restore what was lost. It never could. Children were not brought back. Parents did not get to grow old with their families. Futures were erased forever. But justice mattered because it said something essential. That time does not absolve. That lies eventually collapse. That even the quietest places are not immune to accountability. These cases also leave us with uncomfortable questions. How many warning signs do we miss because someone seems normal? How often do we dismiss fear, intuition, or early red flags? And how many crimes remain buried not because evidence doesn't exist, but because the truth has not yet been uncovered? Iowa is often seen as America's heartland, a place of safety, familiarity, and trust. These cases shattered that illusion, but they also proved something else. That even in the darkest chapters, truth has a way of resurfacing. Sometimes it takes days, sometimes it takes decades, but it comes. And when it does, it reminds us why these stories must be told, not to glorify violence, but to honor victims, expose deception, and ensure that what happened is never forgotten. Because forgetting is the one thing that truly lets evil win.